Esports is a growing phenomenon in the last decade. Games like Overwatch, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and Dota 2 have drawn crowds from all over the world. However, one game has stood out as esports crown jewel, and that game is League of Legends. League of Legends has drawn millions of unique viewers, attracted a wide audience from content creators to even some world leaders, and have shaken up what the definition of a competitive sport can be. There are even players like Faker, who are often compared to global sports icons such as Michael Jordan. And like many competitive sports, rosters will change. Some of the world's most iconic rosters have been changed after poor performance or even some new opportunities. And League of Legends is no stranger to that. From super teams to rookie upstarts, the dynamic of League of Legends always changes. And that dynamic starts with free agency. My name is Jay Sobel. I'm a reporter who has been covering esports for the last 2.5 years. And as a reporter in this industry, free agency is always a period that draws both heartbreaks and fresh life into the scene. With players and teams always looking to expand their horizon, it's no secret that free agency is always enthralling. But why does this happen? And who is ultimately involved? That's where we come in. Over the next hour and a half, I brought in some of my friends in backgrounds such as esports reporting, business, content creation, and more to explain why this vital period is not only a complex puzzle, but one that is more intricate than people may think. The free agency may be 24 hours away, but we're just getting started. Welcome to Esports Talk Free Agency, a discussion of the who's and the what's of the LCS Free Agency. We first need to understand why this period happens. And to do this, I'm pleased to welcome the king of wolf bombs himself, Jacob Wolf. Jacob is an award-winning investigative journalist who first started the free agency streams 3 years ago, as well as working for ESPN and Esports. Now he's the founder and producer of Overcome, creator of the Jacob Wolf Report, and host of the Visionary podcasts. Jacob, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me, Jay. I appreciate it.
So I think one of the things we need to understand is what exactly is free agency?
Yeah, so across the world, players are signing contracts to play on these professional League of Legends teams, and those contracts go to a certain amount of time depending on how long they are. So, I think the max contract now is 3 or 4 years is right. It's cap. They may have extended it a bit longer. It's my brain is mush for some of this, but nonetheless, those contracts have to end at the end of the season, and the end of the season is the evening prior to this free agency open, and so free agency will end on Monday night prior to Thanksgiving, and will open Tuesday morning. So, and it's based around Greenwich Mean Time. So when the clock strikes 0 in the UK. It's a bonanza like across the world, and you see all of these players eligible now to sign new contracts with new teams. Their old contracts are expiring, and so leading up into the weeks of this, and this is why you see a lot of reporting beforehand. Agents are with permission negotiating contracts for these players with prospective new teams. Sometimes, verbal agreements are reached, and then pen is put to paper on this day at that very specific hour. So, that's what we built the show around originally, and that is sort of how everything works. This is the moment the players are able to start truly signing contracts and locking themselves into these teams.
Yeah, you mentioned the players and the teams, and you mentioned agents. So I'm kind of curious, who really is involved in this period?
Yeah, so this is a very busy period for esports professionals more broadly. You have leading up to this moment, and a lot of teams are lucky that they did not attend the World Championship, because then they can understand kind of what's going to happen the next season. They get like a couple months head start on planning. But the teams that did attend the League of Legends World Championship and do want to make changes, it's a 3-week sprint of working on everything involved. So planning a budget. How much money do we have to spend on our roster this year annually, right? And setting all of that up. How much can we spend on this position or that position, right? A lot of teams still very much adhere to that. Not all teams do. Team Liquid last year, I think, was going to build a super team no matter what. And so they just signed the best available players and spent, I would guess, probably more than $5 million annually on salaries, which is a massive, crazy number that I would not expect to see again. Nonetheless, so, you have sort of finance people in these teams. You have general managers involved in these teams. You have attorneys that are usually not inside the teams themselves, but represent the teams outside of it. One that's very known is ESG Law, who represent most of the LCS, and some of the LEC as well. And they're working on this stuff very busily leading up to it and preparing for this. And then you have on the other side of the table, you do have agents and the players themselves. And so most of the professional players in the LCS have agents at this point, or some sort of representation, being an attorney or whatever it may be.
So when a player enters free agency, what are usually their options?
Well, it depends. It's now it's gotten to a point where like it's pretty much understood that teams are making decisions much more swiftly now. For the teams that do not make the World Championship, they will start making these decisions throughout August and September. And so players usually know no later than like mid-October if they have a spot on their existing team or not. And so they are allowed to. That's why you see posts like, I'm still talking to XYZ, but I'm being given permission to talk to other teams. Reach out. Here's my email or my agent's email or whatever it may be. That's why you see a lot of that. And so from there, there's this period, this is where like a lot of the reporting now comes from, is there's this period of their agents or the players talking to teams with permission from their previous teams. But it really is a sort of like free for all. It's very confusing. We saw like, I believe Treats said yesterday or sorry, last week, that his contract like is not being picked up at SK and that he's doesn't have a roster spot. Like most of the LEC rosters are already determined. That used not to be the case a few years ago. I would say part of the reason that rosters are determined so much in advance is because I feel like half of the leagues, at least in the LCS and the LEC, half of the teams in the league don't spend a lot of money, and the other half of the teams do. And so like the best players usually figure out where they're going pretty quickly. And then it's just like budget teams from the other half. So I think that's really changed the reporting landscape more broadly and changed this period of time. It used to be where like you didn't know somebody was going where like until days after this open. I remember years ago, like Power of Evil was this player that was still like debated between a couple different teams, even days after free agency had opened the 3rd Tuesday in November. That doesn't happen as much anymore. I think it's because, people are making different choices about how they spend their money in League of Legends esports at the moment.
Right. And one person I want to give a credit to is LEC Wulu. Brick has had pretty much a handle on the LEC and developed that roster very early. And I know you've worked with him at one point or another. But one of the other things that's interesting, at least within these last few years, is a 4-part kind of system where you have not only the LEC and the LCS, but also academy teams and in more particular regions, the ERLs for LEC. Do you think more players are starting to look at these different options, or are most of them trying to vie for that main spot?
I mean, everybody tries to vie for a main spot. Whether or not you get it is a different story. I do think that we have kind of two things that are happening simultaneously right now. You have a new crop of players who are coming up through those leagues that are now competitive for those main spots in the league. Think of people like Danny and Jojo Pyun, who are compared to their peers, young players in the LCS, right? Like they haven't been around for a long time compared to some of the veterans like Bjergsen or Doublelift, etc. And so when you have that cream of crop that is coming out of that and like basically vying for these top spots, they'll usually cost less money. And that's part of what I was talking about more broadly, is that there's this shift in spending, shift in how people are thinking about money right now, partly because there are bigger issues with money in esports right now. But I think that everyone wants a spot in an LCS team if they can get it, but it may be that they cost too much. It may be that they had a bad season and they need to sort of redeem themselves, or it may be that, teams just think differently about them. They don't think that they're a good fit. So I think there's an excess of talent and a lack of money for some of the top players. And so I think you'll see some people who are teamless this year, like you did with someone like Jensen last year, for example.
Yeah, I remember seeing that period. It was rather interesting to see some of these bigger names. And even this year, we're going to have a wider variety. People like Upset in the LEC not have a team for the split. It's always an interesting manner. And I guess a follow-up to that would be like, when this free agency period happens, and we kind of touched on it already, but what is the likelihood that people don't end up finding themselves on a team? Is it more high than it has been in the past?
Yes, I think so. Again, because half of the teams are not spending a lot of money. And so you have the veteran players who have been around for a long time, and they've had these bigger salaries. They've been worth them. They've demanded them. And that's just not the case. Like, there aren't 10 teams in both leagues, or 10 teams in each league spending like they have in previous years. And so it really does come back to that. I do think it is more likely the veteran players won't find teams this year, just simply for the fact that there's just not as much money to go around. Like I think about some of the teams involved this year and who I've heard about sort of spending big, and it sounds like 100 Thieves is willing to spend big. It seems like Team Liquid's kind of somewhere in the middle. FlyQuest is willing to spend big because they just got a new cash infusion with a new owner, and they've hired Papa Smithy to go figure out this new roster and given him a bigger budget than in past years when they were running on a smaller budget, even though they were competitive some years with a smaller budget. And I think about those teams, but then there are a lot of these other teams, Dignitas, etc., who just kind of spend the minimum, and they're okay with that, or spend, like, not the minimum literally, but you know what I mean. They spend sort of what they can to field a roster that is somewhat competitive. And then there are some teams in the middle, places like CLG and others, who are like, they'll spend enough, but they want to develop talent that just based off of the background of the people that are working there. And they've proved that they can do that, I think. So it's not like it was in 2017 or 2018 and 2019, where the LCS and the LEC franchise and everybody was spending a ton of money on these rosters. That's not happening anymore.
Yeah, gone are the days of the giant super teams like we saw in 2018 with the Team Liquid Double Lift Impact Jensen acquisition. Those days are going to be long gone for a while. I also know that you are an avid sports fan yourself. I always see you commenting on Twitter about sports. Are there any similarities between traditional free agency and sports and esports?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the roster open period is taken from traditional sports and its core. The idea that we had for the original free agency show at ESPN 3 years ago was from traditional, or 4 years ago was from traditional sports. It's something that we went and talked to producers who had worked on, like, the Jump trade deadline show, which is the basketball trade deadline show, and we got their advice and picked their brains on, like, what we could be doing. Somebody built, as people building this show from the ground up. And so, yeah, there is a lot of similarities between the two. But I think that, League of Legends is very unique in its own sense. I think a lot of people need the perspective that esports is still very young and nascent. And so while it likes to look like traditional sports sometimes, the money and the way that things work are just not the same yet. And so we're still in the very early days, I think, of what esports is to be.
Are there any differences between the two?
The biggest difference to me is the professionalism around it. Poaching is a very serious offense in the NBA. It does happen, but it's very infrequent that players are sort of working together to get certain teams. We've seen it more and more frequently, especially since the Miami Heat team with LeBron James and Chris Bosh and Dwayne Wade in the early 2010s. But I think that now in esports, the amount of tampering and poaching that happens in any given year that, like, Riot just doesn't do anything about, it's pretty severe. And it's gotten worse with some agents in particular who don't care about those rules. And so, yeah, it's just not, like, the enforcement around it and sort of the professionalism around it are not the same.
I do want to ask about something we talked about in the beginning of our conversation. We talked about people not understanding what the free agency is. And I want to know, as someone who's been reporting it but also diving into some of these deeper issues, what's something that about the free agency period that a lot of people genuinely don't understand?
Yeah, I don't think they understand a lot of the mechanics of how it works, frankly. Like, I think that, when they, and I'm not taking credit away from him. I've repeatedly tried to give good credit where good credit is due to Wooloo. But when we was like reporting that a player will join a team, those contracts aren't done. Like I have seen situations, it doesn't happen as much anymore, but it used to, where like a player would agree to do something and then, you had to wait 3 weeks to sign a contract. And then in the 3 week period, something would blow up. And, it's part of the reason I've always been really reserved in reporting in my career is I have a good record of doing this because I've always tried to be very good about not speaking too soon. I want assurances that things are going to work out. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. They just think like, oh, players joined this team and it's done. It's a done deal. And it's like, actually, none of it's done until that third Tuesday of every single November hits and people actually start putting their pens to paper and signing these contracts. That's the moment that everything becomes real. And again, it doesn't happen as much anymore as it used to, but there used to be times like back in 2015, 2016, where players would blow up deals. They would say they were going to do one thing and then they'd change their minds. And I remember being in like a very odd position about that some years ago about Forgiven and Piglet and what became Team Liquid, etc. And like, yeah, just a lot of like weird juggling. I don't know. It's a period that I think a lot of people would benefit to learn more about the mechanics of.
Understood. I do want to jump back one more time a little bit. Something we didn't touch on, which I do think is important, is the word contract. We've thrown around contract so many times, and we're not referring to the player here. We're referring to the actual contract itself. What goes into a contract? Is it, since a lot of people may not understand the text that is in the contract, they just see the flashing social media posts.
Yeah, every contract's a little different, but I would say, I mentioned ESG law earlier. ESG has sort of a template contract that they use for a lot of the teams. And it's funny when I see a player contract, I can tell that it's their work based on the way it's worded because I recognize sort of, the legalese, the lawyer language used in them. And so a contract basically outlines compensation. It has a term, right? How long does it last? How long is this player on this team? That's what you see reflected in the global contract database, right? When they end. It covers sort of any other additional performance needs other than actually playing on the team. So, if a player has a certain amount of streaming hours or, they have to fulfill sponsorship events or whatever, right? They have to appear at these sponsorship events throughout the year or appear in content, covers any of that stuff that happens throughout the year. Like all of that's legally set in stone. It covers what a buyout would be, usually, not always. There are fixed buyouts and there are not fixed buyouts. So fixed buyouts are set. They're usually X amount of the player's salary or compensation for, because teams want to make their money back if they're letting go of a player early. And then it covers sort of any benefits associated, right? Just like any standard other employment contract, retirement 401k, healthcare, any of that a player needs to deal with. And then it also covers termination. So like if a player wants to terminate early, that usually comes with them forfeiting money or paying back a portion of money. Or if a team wants to terminate early, they're usually quite team favored that a team can cut the contract early. A lot of agents have been fighting, player agents have been fighting to make the termination period longer and the pay longer. So if a player gets cut early, say they're 1 year into a 3-year contract, you can't just like terminate that person and leave them on their ass. You have to give them a certain amount of notice and you have to pay them a certain amount of money. And so it covers kind of all those things. And then just like your usual, like, what is a breach of contract? How is a breach of contract mended? Sort of just, the more boring legal stuff. But really those points I made earlier are the big key parts of these player contracts.
And my final question for you is, as someone who's been doing this for a while, what should people expect to see on Tuesday?
Yeah, I think that Europe may be a little bit different than this, but at least in America and the LCS, I do think you'll be surprised by how few teams are investing in the biggest players. I have no doubt we've seen reporting that like Doublelift and Bjergsen and Spica are like out there trying to shop themselves as a package to certain teams. I believe that to be true. I would be surprised if they don't find a home. Somebody will do it. But we won't see as many sort of big spin, big swing teams as we have in past seasons. We're in a really tough time right now for esports where, a lot of people made a lot of investor promises in 2016 and 2017 and 2018 about how much money they were going to make in 5 years. Almost none of those have come true. The ecosystem for esports is in a bad place fiscally. The economy is in a bad place fiscally too, which is sort of double whammy here. The entire world is sort of headed towards a recession, and so loans are harder to get. Raising venture capital right now is really tough, especially if you're a business like an esports team who's been around for a long time and they're unable to, raise more money because the valuations are so crazy. And so, yeah, a lot of teams are being a lot more hyper conservative with their money. So don't be surprised if you see LCS teams that are confusing, that have a lot of young players on them who don't make as much money as the veterans. And if you see a lot of veteran players who don't have jobs, that's sort of my expectation for next week.
Jacob, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
One of the crucial parts of any esports organization is the team behind it. Free agency often shows the parts of the teams coming together, whether it be one day or an entire month. But one of the things that is important is understanding why these parts work. To do this, I brought in some of my friends who are experts in team analysis. Carver Fish. Carver got his start as an LPL expert and now writes about all things league at Dexerto. And Kari is an esports flex commentator, host, pundit, and kindred lover who has appeared on LCS, North American Academy, and much more. Carver and Kari, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, happy to be here. So excited to finally talk about League of Legends.
I got an interesting question for you guys to start off our panel. It may sound a little bit of common sense, but I kind of want to know from you guys, what actually does an LCS team compose of?
Yeah, so in comparison to the early days of esports, there are a lot of moving parts with teams, and it really varies depending on the team, right? Like some teams have behavioral coaches and people that help maintain the health of their players, but realistically, you have your 5 main roles, subs wherever possible, and then an entire academy team that you can pull from as well, or I guess NACL now. You have a coach, which the role of a coach varies a lot depending on the team. You'll see a lot of people blame things on the coach when in reality, every team kind of operates different. There's a very different dynamic between, some teams have a support that is really vocal and likes to direct things, whereas some teams will have like a really quiet support, for example, right? So a lot of these teams have that same core, but what's around it is very different depending on budget, depending on the dynamic between the players on the team, and also depending on how well the team's actually doing. Because if most teams that don't do well don't have as much budget to invest in things like having like a really nice esports facility to practice in, which can really help improve the quality of players that they have in their organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add on to that, there's also like levels of coaches as well. We've seen the rise of positional coaches, especially in this last year. Golden Guardians kind of led the charge on that one, and we saw other organizations follow suit. But now, hilariously, Golden Guardians is actually trimming their positional staff. So whether or not there's a lot of efficacy there remains to be determined.
And you guys mentioned both times scouting for players, whether it be coming from academy. Some players we've even seen come up from solo queue prodigies. I know those are 2 examples, but there are dozens of other examples. Where do people usually, when they're scouting for teams, where do they go to get this talent?
As far as talent scouting goes, I can speak to North America and a little bit of LEC, but for the most part, solo queue is the Wild West, and we don't necessarily pull unpolished players from there a lot of the time. Sometimes it can happen, and sometimes you can sort of polish that player to learn about a team dynamic. But a lot of the times, these players will end up paying their dues in either amateur, academy. Sometimes they will be in academy and they'll have been subbing for years before they ever even get their shot at the LCS stage. But one thing remains really important is that these players who are on these teams, first and foremost, have a sense of what a team dynamic is like. And that's not always the case in solo queue. It's a very self-reliant thing. So pulling players out of solo queue, sometimes you have to undo the damage that solo queue can do to your brain. But yeah, I'm sure Carver has some other additional thoughts here as well.
Where do we get players from? Other countries? No.
Well, that is one way to put it.
No.
But true.
Okay, so a lot of the time, big talent that comes into the LCS does actually come from other countries, but more specifically challengers leagues from Korea. You'll see a lot of the players that come into the LCS and do really well. For instance, Berserker was in T1's Challenger League team. Also, another very interesting import, Yuji, FlyQuest's Yuji, was like playing in Korean solo queue on like 200 ping from country far away from I believe it was Mongolia. But it's finding talent is really difficult because especially in North American solo queue, there are a lot of one tricks. There are a lot of people that have like have cemented their play style, and especially a lot of content creators over here that, I'm a Shaco player. Well, that's not going to work in pro play. So how do you translate that? How do you translate someone that is rank 1 in solo queue into a pro player and unlearn, like Gara mentioned, unlearn those really bad habits that do well in solo queue and very poorly in pro play? We even see players get into the LCS that haven't unlearned that kind of stuff, that have gotten by in the academy from having a really high level of skill. Immortals Kenvi comes to mind, someone who destroyed an academy, went to LCS and got stomped. And it's tough because you need like a good coach and a good staff around that player to find their full potential and get them to where they're crushing the LCS the same way they were in the Challengers League, because they're missing like something fundamental, something that needs to be taught. Finding talent is really hard, especially in North America's current landscape where people are kind of down in the LCS. Solo queue is hard. Queue times are really long. It's difficult.
Game quality is terrible.
The other thing that's interesting too is queue times for Challenger solo queue in Korea are like 2 to 3 minutes. In North America, they're like 20. So what ends up happening is there are people who have to sit in queue, and they're just players in North America spend so much more time staring at a queue timer, and it makes it really difficult for people here to be motivated, which is why we pull a lot of talent from other countries that have a more cultivated high elo environment. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
Oh, that was great. That was so in depth too. I have something to add to that too, is that I was watching Os. I like Pabu. He was on Pentanet formerly. And it took him 4 hours to get a pop. So Os challengers, I know, the deep breath. It's pretty intimidating. The quality is not there. That sucks.
I think one thing I do want to kind of talk about a little bit, and we'll come back to this. You mentioned this one trick. I think of one actually very key example was DRX's Pioshek, who was a Kindred one trick, and now is a world champion. But we do see some of these one tricks do make their way into solo queue and onto these academy and amateur teams. People like General Sniper from 100 Thieves Nets is a big example of upcoming talent that was pulled from the solo queue ladder. If he were to become a player, he would technically classify as a rookie. And one of the things that's often really what's the word I'm looking for? Really exemplified in League of Legends is veteran versus rookie talent. I'll give rookie to Kari. I'll give veteran to Carver. Would you guys be able to classify what the difference is between these two terminologies, especially in League of Legends?
Yeah, rookie terminology, it does vary by region. I'll just use the LCS since that's the closest example that I have. For example, well, I'll just say in LCK, and correct me if I'm wrong, but rookies have a very well-defined rookie period. Whereas in the LCS, you could be playing in the LCS Academy for 4 years and never have received any accolades. And I think in the LCS, it's about the accolades. So if you've never received Rookie of the Year, or you've never received MVP of the split, or any of those other accolades, you're still considered technically a rookie. And I do believe it's pretty much contingent on accolades. But it also is contingent on how much time you've spent on the LCS main stage. So we sort of go rookies by, 1, 2, sometimes 3 years. If they go further than that, then they generally, a lot of those players end up falling off because they don't make it to LCS. So rookies don't always have survivability, but the ones that do, generally, it comes down to accolades is what stops you from being a rookie, basically.
Mm. Yeah, it's tough because there's a select few players that have been kind of stuck in the academy system. It feels like Darshan comes to mind.
Yeah,
Guy is cracked. Darshan is probably better than most of the LCS top laners we have right now, and he's stuck. And he's I believe he's a free agent right now, or at least his contract with Cloud9 is expiring, and he's allowed to explore new things. But man, it's tough because it takes a long time to become a veteran, and the reality of esports is players who have put so much time into this one thing, it's very difficult to see a path after that. So once you're a veteran, your priorities kind of shift. And it goes from I want to win to I want to be able to live and be able to make this career that I built for myself last for the rest of my life. How do I do that? Vulcan's tweet thread kind of blew up. I'm not going to get too into that, but there is a certain culture among veterans where you have an upside, where they know a lot about the game. They've been around for a long time. They're proven talent. They're very good at what they do. But it's, on the other hand, it's very difficult for them to justify taking risks and doing things that would, make investors or coaches angry, where they want to try this pick, but if they lose that pick, people are going to flame them. It doesn't matter if the people that flame them have no idea what they were going for and haven't seen the scrims. It still doesn't look good for the team. So in a way, teams can benefit from having a rookie that really wants to prove themselves, because it feels like that can sort of give people hunger and the willingness and motivation to compete at a very high level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely love that, by the way. Sorry to interrupt, Jay. It's always like the back and forth, but rookies are like the puppies that like invigorate the older dogs. They like want to play. And then you have like, so that's like Danny and Jojo Pew, and like running at the feet of Vulcan is it inspires him to become a better shot caller, a better leader. So that dynamic is really like kind of adorable in a certain sense.
I think a good example of this also, maybe somewhere in the middle ground, is the CLG roster that just happened in summer of 22, where players like Contracts, Dokla, who at one point were rookies in their own right, ended up having a 1 or 2 rough splits, sent to the academy leagues, and then were able to prove themselves in a different manner. So that's kind of like the middle ground, where they're not exactly rookies, but they're not quite veteran talent as well. And again, kind of what Kari just said, they need to prove themselves a little bit. We did talk about this quite a bit, whether it be shot calling or just other traits. What are some traits that teams look for in an individual player?
All right. I'll keep it brief, hopefully. One of the things that, there's always like this debate about, how can NA get better? How can NA get better? And a lot of people are like, more hours, which sure, maybe. But I think the other thing is the attitude and mindset of our team and players. And I think that that's been changing a lot. The way that Evil Geniuses scouts, from what we can tell, has a lot to do with like willingness to learn and attitude. It's not necessarily picking up the most flashy. Jojo Pion and Danny are the most flashy of the year players, I would say, but they don't always go for the most mechanically gifted players, but rather the ones that can be shaped into those mechanically and team-based gifted players. I think one of the most important things is that team mindset, because all it takes is one like top laner with a bad attitude that can make the entire team's flow just fall apart. So that willingness to actually be a part of a team and actually be melded is starting to become a priority in NA, where it used to be like, he flames people on Twitter and he's got a lot to say, he's a hot shot, but he's real talented. But we started to realize that those big hotshots aren't always effective teammates.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Kari mentions that. Actually, I grabbed an interview that I had with Oto Omne, who, yes, isn't in North America, but I did ask him about, what it takes to develop a super team. And man, this has been the year of a collapse for every super team that anybody has ever put together. It is proven over everything else, even up to the finals where DRX wins against T1 with the power of friendship.
An anime.
An anime.
And Genshin Impact.
And definitely Genshin
Bear
Impact.
spending 30 grand on Genshin Impact. Yeah, it's proven more than anything else that having a team that works well together will just be so much better for you than getting together a team that is individually very good at what they do. And having a team that gets along. So I'm going to use a very asinine example here. This is taking things real basic.
I'm excited.
So imagine you're in the team facility and you left some leftovers in the fridge and your jungler ate your leftovers. Now, yes, these are pro players, but how do we know that before a game someone's jungler didn't eat somebody's leftovers? Maybe they don't trust them as much to gank their lane. I know that sounds so stupid, but the reality is that the LCS is filled with people that are in their late teens and early 20s who have not really been in these professional environments before. And I think when teams are trying to scout, that it's really good to look for in-game leaders and out-of-game leaders that can create a really good team environment where people can grow and not have, because yes, that sounds like a really dumb thing. It sounds so small. Someone stole somebody's lunch, whatever. If something like that happens over and over again between players and a rift forms between these players, and you can have teams just collapse based on things that aren't even in the game. Maybe in theory they work well together, but in practice they don't. And it's an impossible job. Like, there is no perfect team. It's never going to happen. But what people can do is try their best to scout players that have somewhat similar play styles. For instance, if you have a carry top laner, you want that person to be able to play carries. So you need a jungler that can work with the top laner well, play either junglers that are good in the early game or that are really strong for initiating fights, right? Because you don't have that top lane frontliner. So when you're building a team, if you have the best carry jungler and the best carry top laner in the region paired, it's probably not going to go very well. So not only do you have to think about players' personalities, which, I mean, it's kind of hard to gauge that off the rip, but also you have to think about how well they play together, and whether or not their play styles are even compatible in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Carver, we all know you're talking about Santorin. It's the plug and play jungler. That guy is such a good team player. Like, he has no interest at all. Well, maybe a little interest in the glory, but it's those team players that are really important. Like, just as important as like main character Bjergsen, for example, or Danny. Well, actually, Danny played weak side, but even still, main character Jojo Pyun. Even still, having people who are selfless and think about how to get the team ahead as opposed to themselves, absolutely irreplaceable. Such a good point, Carver. Such a good point.
And Jay, we'll move on real quick, but just an example. So we talked about Pioshik a bit, and I think it's the greatest example recently that we could ever talk about, where you could see they were hovering his kindred, his one trick, his signature champion, and he gave it up to play tanks. If those games could have gone very differently if Pioshik decided to pick his character that he wanted. Like, that is a very clear and visual, like, this is someone humbling themselves and playing for the team and prioritizing his teammates over himself. And that's the kind of thing that really, creates teams that can get titles.
Probably one of the most interesting examples to this was last year's C9 with Summit. We love Summit as a top laner, but I think there was a lot of criticism over the team's adaptability to play around him. And this kind of does remind me of the debate between domestic and foreign talent. Kari, my question to you is, as someone who covers more of that domestic leagues, like the amateur academy scenes, how do we know, is there a way to know when these players are truly ready for the LCS, or is it just a shot in the dark, essentially?
Unfortunately, getting a starting spot in the LCS is so difficult that there is no way to know when the time will come. Knowing when a player is ready, I feel like staff players, I feel like everybody knows when they are ready. I feel like King, for example, last year, who was subbing in on Cloud9, was not ready. He was extremely nervous on stage. You could see his hands shaking. And if maybe he had had more practice on stage, unfortunately, COVID took that away from him. But nobody, even his own staff, didn't necessarily, like, they were like telling the fans, be gentle with him. It's his first time on the LCS stage. Whereas, for example, Kaori, who came in and subbed for Danny in Evil Geniuses, they were all like, he's good, he's got it. Like, we know he's ready for the stage. We know we've prepared him adequately. So whether you're ready or not, if one of those main slots goes down, if you're an academy, you are going on stage no matter what. So I think staff and everybody knows when they're ready, but sometimes it can't be helped.
And Carver, as someone who's covered the LPL, I know you kind of tend to look for some of those diamonds in the rough players who may not have gotten their shot in a higher team in the LPL or LCK, but then come to North America and surprisingly do well. I think of someone like a Berserker, for example. When is it appropriate for a team to possibly consider going outside the North American talent pool? Is it a budget thing, or is it, hey, we really think this player would suit well in our environment? Someone like an Inspired, for example, coming from the LEC.
You have to really be on board with the way that they play. When you're bringing in a pro from another region, especially if they don't have the best English going in and have to learn on the fly. Now, full credit to Berserker. He's ready to do full interviews in English. That guy is cracked. But not everybody's that fast with language, and that's okay. So I'll use an example. I think OMG Shanji is like one of the best top players in the world. That guy's crazy. Love him. If you were to put him on a team in North America, you would have to play around him. If you didn't play around him properly, you would have a very similar situation to something like Summit. A lot of things have to go right. Like, you have to have a player that's down to live in North America and down to eat different food and operate on different hours and be away from their family and friends to do this new thing. And not everybody's going to be down for that. Some pros come over here and leave, maybe partially because of performance, but also because they just weren't happy with living here. It's a culture shock. But yeah, import talent is when you don't import to fill holes on a team, you import to build one. And you get players around that strong import talent that can fill the holes that maybe, oh, hey, I have a really hard carry mid laner. We need a jungler that can support them, not one that's trying to outshine them. Oh, hey, we have this really good AUC. Let's get someone that can play Tom Kench support, that can keep them alive, that can support a carry play style, rather than Core JJ maybe is a good example. Someone who's really good at initiating, right? So it's difficult, but you want to go imports first and then fill holes, not the other way around.
One quick question for you guys before we wrap up our segment here. When we're looking at these teams going into this particular offseason, I know I talked to Jacob Wolf earlier in our show, and he mentioned that there may be some roster things that are going on with budgets especially. But at the same time, we know North America, someone's going to be surprising somewhere. So I want to give each of you a minute just to kind of think, if you guys have to look at some team examples, what do you think one of the most important things that are going to be looked at for teams heading into 2023?
Going into 2023, I think that Evil Geniuses presented their final proof of concept after about 3 years of working at it and insisting that they would eventually have something to show for it. This year, they really, truly, and genuinely did. And I think that proof of concept proves that coaching staff is essential. And with Evil Geniuses emptying out their coaching coffers, retaining Kelsey Moser, which is an incredible pickup for them, as like sort of the base for their coaching staff. I think that's going to be huge, especially, and I mean this in the most non-flamey way. The failure of Quixoto to mesh with the team at Team Liquid is obviously going to give them some pause as well. They'll be looking very, strictly at where they could have gone right, where they could have gone wrong. Cloud9 had an emphasis with LS coming in that early time. It didn't work because he wasn't compatible with Jack's processes. He wants meetings every single morning, for example. So I think more than ever, coaching staff is going to come in clutch this year. I think that's going to be extremely important.
I agree 100%. And, especially seeing, as much as it kind of sucks that Golden Guardians have outed positional coaches, they do have a brand new facility. Like, Golden Guardians is a team to watch for me for sure. I'm really excited to see what happens with them.
2023 is their year for sure.
Yeah, FlyQuest too.
Genuinely though.
The thing to keep in mind is, yes, people aren't paying as much for players, but that is across the board. So budget has gone down for everybody, which is kind of unfortunate to admit, but that doesn't mean that it can't bounce back. And that also means that players that were previously expensive are still expensive, but not nearly as much so. I don't think that budget cuts will impact the region as much as people think, because everybody's scaling back pros that were worth 2 million or worth 1 million. It's just kind of the reality of it. I do think it's difficult to say what's going to happen because the LCS is kind of behind the off-season roster apocalypse shuffle that the LEC has had already. So we don't really know a lot of the teams yet. I do hope that when we see the teams that they'll be a little bit more formed around creating synergy, creating a play style, creating something that we can look at most teams in the LCS and have like a firm grasp of their play style and their identity, because I don't feel like we can really do that with many teams from last split, where you can look at a team and pick out their play style. Team Liquid's a great example, because it's really difficult to look at Team Liquid from the last year and figure out what their goals were, what their play style was going into game, and what they thought their win condition was as a team. And if you go into a game with no idea how you're going to win, it's probably not going to go great.
Yeah, and that's like where the coach comes in. He's supposed to have the big picture, because as we all know, players are obsessed with their role, obsessed with their lane, and it's the coach's job to pull the bigger picture out of all of his teammates, find their strengths, and bring that vision together. So I think Carver and I unanimously agree that we will see the players that we know and love, but maybe a little more controlled this time.
All right, with that, that's all the questions that I have for you for this segment. Carver and Kari, thank you so much, and I loved hearing your insight about the team dynamic.
It's been a pleasure. This has been so fun.
For putting this on, I appreciate it.
As we all know, esports is not only an industry of entertainment, but also one of business and entrepreneurship. Insurance companies, food and drink brands, and even some NBA teams have partnered with the LCS top brands. And when it comes to free agency, sometimes dollar signs make the rosters. But why is the business side of free agency so important? My next two panelists will have the answers. Joining me are David Shynock and Robert Haynes. David is a League of Legends content creator on TikTok and a senior financial analyst in the media and entertainment industries. And Robert is a co-owner of the Game House and covers TSM on Talking TSM, along with anything else LCS related on the Game House. David and Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So my first question for you, I kind of covered it a little bit in the intro, but we all know that the relationship between the players and teams exists. But what other relationships do teams in the esports industry have?
There's a lot of different relationships that go on within, how these teams, I guess, operate, especially with brands. I think that that's probably one of the biggest relationships that maybe doesn't get talked about nearly as much. We know some of the big ones, and especially lately with, I think, major insurance companies like State Farm being so involved in the LCS. But I would say that is probably, I don't know about you, David, but I would say that's probably the one that gets maybe talked about a lot, but not like actually known, or there's not much known about them and how long some of them are.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is just the relationship and kind of circle that you have between the players and the fans and the organization, and then the organization and its owners, and how that all interconnects with each other. You're ultimately driving revenue from the various different places. Like, your fans need to buy the merch, need to buy apparel, need to watch your content to be able to help feed into advertising dollars, which helps pay for everything. This industry doesn't just run on good times and happy vibes. It costs money to do everything.
And yeah, I think that's often forgot about, just because of the fact that people are always like, oh, well, why is this team not spending money, right? Why are they not doing these things? And like you said, there's that triangle that requires so much more, I think, attention, and something that the fans really don't dive into nearly enough. And it's not, to be fair, their fault necessarily on that. It's not something that's readily available or known most of the time, because esports teams still like to lack transparency on anything monetarily to most degrees, unless if they raise a huge funding amount and then they're like, hey, look at all the money that we just raised, and you have no idea where it's going to go towards.
To be fair, business isn't also the sexiest topic in the world, depending on who you ask. Like, there are some people that are going to be that look at that State Farm deal and be like, okay, that's a lot of money. This is great. Let's go. And there's another group of people, probably the majority, that just look at it and are like, so when does Double Lift play?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it really is. And I think it's not, again, it's not an indictment on the fans necessarily, but it is something that I know I struggle with when I'm having conversations with people who are not business minded or business focused, because they will misunderstand when I say, hey, like, there's not going to be money on this team. Like, they just don't have the ability to do these certain things. And then when they announce something like FlyQuest being bought by the Florida Panthers, and I say, wow, this team's potentially going to have a lot more funds available to them because they have a new ownership group that is excited and clearly invested into them. Some people don't understand that can be a massive driver. And I think that that's a relationship, Jay, between brands, between just the money that's coming in, and I think maybe the lack of understanding at times for certain fan bases and certain groups.
Mm-hmm. Robert, you mentioned a good point about advertising, and I feel like, David, I know this is a field that you extensively work in the financial district. How much does advertising play a role into whether it be, I know like the LCS has its own advertising, but for teams especially, they have advertised deals. You see it with like keyboards that they play with, or just general content. Would you mind kicking off just like explaining a little bit about why advertising, especially when it's getting closer to this start of the season, is so important?
Absolutely. So there's your main revenue drivers are always going to be the things that fund your league, that give you the ability to do everything that we're doing. In traditional sports, your three main areas are your sponsorships, your media rights deals, which media rights is basically selling the right for people to watch your product. ESPN, ABC, CBS, all of them will pay the various different companies that put on these sports to be able to have the rights to show it. Riot Games currently doesn't have a media rights deal, so there's no revenue to be had there. So we're still left with sponsorships. And then you have ticket sales and food and beverage. Given that the LCS only has a very small studio in LA, which doesn't always sell out, and then you also only travel on the road twice a year, that's not a significant portion of your revenue stream either. So the only thing that you are purely relying on to drive in the majority of your revenue to keep all this alive is your sponsorships. So whenever we have these big brand deals like State Farm, like I think it's Rawcat, when you have Spotify and all these other brands like MasterCard as well, they're the ones ultimately keeping the ship alive until we can find ways to drive other revenue streams.
And to like add on to that, right? We saw with the Overwatch League, they tried to hit all three all at once, right? They tried to go on the road. They did recently a media deal with YouTube that has ostracized some certain fans. And obviously they had the sponsorship things. Now, I don't, like David's saying, I think that you need all three eventually. And I think as the LCS and as the league matures, because as much as everybody in esports wants to be like, oh, the LCS is 10 years old, wow, like that's so great, right? When we're talking about sports leagues, things that last, right? Baseball's over 120 years old. Okay, we are talking about baby steps at the most for where the LCS is right now. And so I do think bringing up media rights, something I hadn't really thought about recently. I remember a conversation about it with somebody a couple of years ago, but I do think that's one that realistically the LCS should be looking at. I think League of Legends in general, I know that it can technically, cut off access, but that's a huge selling point. Like every year the NFL, and I like to bring in traditional sports because I know everybody else hates it, but in terms of the way that some of the business things are done, it is something you have to look at, right? Because regardless of what people want to talk about with advertising, with any money that comes in business wise, this is an entertainment business industry. They are there to entertain you and they need money to be able to do it. And so having a media rights deal every year for baseball, for the NBA, for the NFL, right? That actually goes up so much that they can increase, like in the NFL, the cap increase is sometimes not always, but mostly based around when they get a new media rights deal, because then there's more money funneled into the league. I really love that David brought that up, because I think that would be something that the LCS should seriously look at, because that would be a huge revenue driver in a way that I think a lot of people wouldn't really consider for the LCS to make a ton more money.
I think we're still a ways off of a
I
media
agree.
rights deal,
I agree.
because there's so many other changes happening to the ecosystem right now. We have format changes and potential additional tournaments coming to the global League of Legends ecosystem. The LCS is potentially moving days. Like, you have a lot of different moving pieces that we still don't know what's happening. If you throw a media rights deal on top of that and say, hey, you can no longer watch it at this spot that you used to previously watch it for, whether that's Twitch, YouTube, or we have no clue what that deal would look like. You're just adding more levers of change that you can't isolate year over year what actually happened. So, for example, say we have a 30% drop in viewership this year. This is a completely made up number, but the only thing we did was move days. We can isolate it to just that variable.
Sure.
When you change a lot of things all at once, then you can no longer say, okay, what happened? Was it the days or was it this? We have no clue. So I think we're still a ways off until we're comfortable enough to pull the trigger on that one.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, I don't disagree with that at all. I think the only problem is that the LCS and realistically League as a whole, outside of Worlds, changes way too often. They are constantly making knee-jerk reactions. And I'm not saying that potential movement of days or anything else, right? Especially with what was discussed in Travis Gafford's interview with the head of Esports. I thought that was very enlightening, that they're looking, I assume they were looking at the numbers, but the way that they were looking at the numbers, I think, was super important. And so I just worry that the LCS and realistically leagues in general really are too quick to make changes. And I feel like at some point, right, because like you're not wrong. I think right now, if they were to do a media deal, like, and they were to announce it over this offseason, I would say it's a huge mistake. But I think if they don't do something like that in the next couple of years, then I do think they're missing out on a major revenue driver. And I do also believe that the leagues are changing so often anyways. I just don't know that there's going to be that time, at least initially, right, that you're going to be able to do it in a I don't know, in the next 5 to 10 years, let's say.
I think that leads into a great segue about the teams themselves. We understand how the LCS has a bigger ecosystem of advertising and media deals and business partners going about. But one of the things I think is important, and I think David said it best in one of his TikToks, there is definitely a budget shift in the LCS. I was talking to Jacob Wolf earlier in our show, and he said that there will definitely be some budget issues with some teams. Robert, I'll start with you on this question. How much do you think these outside business deals interfere with like the roster decisions of the LCS?
I think it depends. I mean, if you're talking about outside business deals as in how much money are they bringing in, right?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to. Yes.
Then yeah, I mean, they are, I think, massive, because none of us really know the rev split that is between all the LCS teams. I believe I could have missed it, but
reportedly 2 to 3 million from the LCS.
Oh yeah, that's right.
To
Okay.
individual teams, reported by Travis Gafford.
That is right. I apologize. Yeah, I mean, listen, that money is probably dedicated to something pretty individually for most teams. And obviously they have to make money. That can't just be $3 million that's just thrown straight at the roster. So I think that some of these deals on the outside are what helps them. And it is really, again, it's an interesting dichotomy between traditional sports and sports, right? A lot of these teams in sports, all of the money that goes to them goes technically towards the team. These organizations, most of them at least, have multiple teams in multiple esports. So a deal like, for example, FTX, right, falling through for TSM, while TSM are continuously reiterating that they are a stable business, which I do believe, especially seeing some of the moves that people have been chastising them for at times, to be honest with you, letting go staff in different areas. I I believe that deal was more for, and I think I've put it out there on Twitter too a couple times, that deal was more important for growth. It wasn't necessarily for stability. And I do think that these outside deals are going to be they are important for, I think, a couple different reasons, and one of them being that, like, how they are attached to the players, right? I think if you have a better roster and everything like that, there may be more brand deals that come in, which thus allows you to take that money and put it elsewhere. It's a really complicated question, to be honest with you, because there is so much that goes into the roster building and the amount of money that comes in, and whether or not that outside money is even, like, again, if TSM signs a deal with Bitcoin or something like that next, right? Just to give an example, that money that they sign may not necessarily go towards the LCS at all. It may go towards other teams, esports, their new facility that they're building. It's really tough to know, because we don't know the inner workings of the teams, to be honest with you. And I know that's probably not the answer most people are looking for, but yeah, it could impact it significantly or not at all.
And it also depends on the deliverables of the deal as well.
Yep.
Steve was very public for Team Liquid, talking about how when they missed Worlds, there were certain deliverables that they had with their various partners that they're not going to be able to give them, which means that you either A, have to come up with something else to give to your sponsor to make sure that they feel validated in the money that they're giving you, or you have to give the money back if you've already accepted it. Like, there's a lot of inner workings of these deals. We don't ultimately know what happens individually with each one, but different organizations are going to use their money differently. Some might use it for growth. Some might use it to fund their current operations. Some of them might use it elsewhere in the business. It's very difficult to tell, but the one thing that we can tell from the market as a whole right now is that the amount of cash that is out there to be received from sponsors is dropping consistently. You're not being able to deliver, like, Doublelift having 2 million followers on Twitter meant a lot 2 years ago, or like 3 or 4 years ago. Nowadays, if he's not in as much content for whatever team he goes to or anything else like that, then is his brand value really as high as we used to make it out to be?
Yeah,
Question
and
changes.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that too, another area that I know we haven't discussed yet is investments, right? That outside money has been the driver for esports and teams for, well, at least the last 7 to 10 years, right? And if you've noticed, all of these teams that went out and got these big crypto deals and stuff like that, that was similar to the amount of money that they were receiving from investors in Series A's, B's, and C's. And those aren't happening right now. And there's a very, I don't think that that's also being talked about nearly at all right now. But when was the last time you saw a team get a major funding round? You know they're still wanting to do it, and they've been operating their businesses based off of this scaling model that is having all this investment money prop them up. If you can't be profitable on your own after all that money is gone, then that's going to create a big issue in the ecosystem. And that's why, even though as much as people hated the fact that some of the teams were owned by NBA teams, to be honest, they were kind of some of the safest ones, because they were a part of an ownership group that was pretty stable in some other area. So it's really, investment is another thing that I think we have to be talking about, because a lot of the growth and a lot of the money that we saw from Team Liquid, from Cloud9, from TSM, from 100 Thieves, Evil Geniuses, right? A lot of that came from series funding rounds that you're not seeing right now, especially in a global recession or oncoming global recession, depending on your point of view.
So earlier in the conversation, we mentioned Doublelift, and Doublelift's a very well-known player. When you make these roster changes, do you think like signing bigger names like Doublelift or maybe other massive names bring certain deals that were previously inaccessible?
It depends. I mean, like David was talking about earlier, deliverables, I think, are a pretty important part of some of these deals for these people. Now, I think endemic, like the difference between endemic and non-endemic like brands and advertising, I think is extremely important, right? If you go to I think a good example of this was back when Gillette was doing a deal with Bjergsen, right? It was pretty clear because a lot of their branding, right, is based around popular individuals, right? So Tom Brady's I don't know, whatever actors they're feeling like, it's not just necessarily that, hey, we have a team or a league that's part of the brand. It was an individual that was a part of the brand. So with TSM working with Bjergsen, obviously at the time, Gillette was technically a part of like the TSM deal, right? I'm sure that had a major influence on the way they wanted to do things. But for things like, I don't know, Alienware, right? I don't think they particularly care what player it is that they are doing, like if that's going to impact them, because they believe, I'm sure their marketing plan is more of, if we are, a brand or a brand that's a part of all 10 LCS teams, that's great for us. We don't need to have just one individual kind of drive that. And I think that is, I mean, a double lift may be a little different just because of how big his stream is. I think if we're using that as an example, because if you can get your brand on his stream, that's a lot more valuable than just being attached to Someday on whatever team Sunday is going to end up being on, right? But I think those are few and far between right now, especially in the LCS.
It also depends on what you're signing that partnership for. For example,
True.
A lot of the original deals that we would see, or at least that we heard of, were for content.
Mhm.
You sign a deal, you give a certain amount of money, the partner is always listed as a sponsor of the video, and then it would either be on the documentary series or the other supplemental pieces that came out. Given that we've seen pretty much the evaporation of content as budgets get cut across the various LCS orgs, you're then also having a direct effect on sponsorships as well, because then when you're trying to sell your brand to them, when you're going into these meetings and you have your pitch deck, and normally what would be a component of like, we got X amount of views, certain engagement rate, and you're pitching your content, well, it all disappeared. So now like that avenue that you can potentially book a sponsorship for, even with a player like Double Lift, is in limbo.
Mm-hmm. I feel like this is now kind of a good segue into something you guys made sure that we want to talk about, and that is the investment side of things. Especially as we get closer and closer to free agency, when you see some of these deals being signed. I think one of the big ones that comes to mind is when C9 made that massive investment into Perks and had to make sure essentially their investors knew what they were getting into. When it comes to free agency and when it comes to the budgets, how much do investments play a role into securing the funding, but also making sure that they keep themselves afloat?
I mean, for right now, it shouldn't be anything at all because they're not getting any investments. But I do think that we saw with new teams coming into the league and with because like when new orgs joined in like 2019 and well, obviously like 2017 when everything got started, but when 2019 we had the 3 new orgs that came in, all of them raised a Series A or B round, I believe, right around the time that they were joining, because they needed that money not only to buy the spot, but then they decided probably to invest in and get talent, right? I think Evil Geniuses was a prime example of this when they went out and got Bang and the rest of the crew that ultimately didn't do a whole lot. I think nowadays investments shouldn't be included or thought about really at all in terms of these roster signings. And I don't also believe, to be clear, I do not believe that this is necessarily affecting the market right now. I do believe that recessionary times are more important, and people have to understand these are businesses. They are having to run at as close to even at, I guess, at a minimum as they can. They still obviously want to be so far in the black that they're making money, but they don't want to dip into the red. And if the decision between risking it to sign 2 more players for $500,000 more each is going to put you further in the red than you are comfortable, then sure, that's going to affect it. And obviously, if they all raised another $100 million in a Series B or C round, then sure, I'm pretty positive that these LCS rosters would have more money put behind them. But I think that these orgs are starting to become businesses, not just startup, eternal growth mechanisms that they've been in the past. And so there's a part of the community that was used to the amount of money that was being thrown at all of this when all the initial raises happened. But I don't know that we will, at least in the next year or two, see that. It may be ever, honestly. It really just depends, because at some point, all the people who have invested are not going to want to get diluted anymore. And they're also not going to want to see these companies have to operate on every 3 years getting new major investments in order to just survive, because that's just not a stable business. That's just throwing money down a bottomless pit that will eventually just hit the bottom when there is no foundation there whatsoever.
And that's the key thing here is, like you said, whenever everybody came in 2017, you get all these investment rounds that come in. That money ultimately is due back. They're not just giving you millions of dollars to say, here, have fun with it. Like, the expectation is they're giving you, say, $5 million to get you $5 million plus interest after a certain amount of time. And it is now publicly known that nobody's gotten their money back in that capacity. So the reason why you're seeing all these budget cuts, why you're seeing all these teams, as you said, become businesses, start to cut back, try to break even, is because that money is owed back to investors. And if you clearly were not driving the revenue and not driving the attention that people thought it would. And at some point that has to come back down to earth. Now you'll see FlyQuest, because they just got into it, raise money, spend it as always. But in 4 to 5 years, we'll be having the same exact conversation unless something major changes.
Yeah. And I think that's the important word, is changes, right? There are ways for these LCS teams to, I mean, they're, again, we already talked about, right? They're bringing in $3 million in splitting that revenue. I'm sure, like, across the LCS, the bigger deals and everything else that we've talked about, the more money that is poured into it, the better things are going to be for these LCS orgs, because then they can start to operate more like true businesses. And listen, I don't think there's been a better time for these LCS teams to kind of go through this, to be honest. These growing pains and these budget cuts are going to establish who's going to be around for the next 10, 20 years plus, hopefully, right? There will be orgs in the next year or two. They may not be LCS orgs, but there will be orgs that are going to die from this. They will no longer exist because they've been operating under the assumption that they can just raise eternally, and they didn't come up with a good enough business plan to create that stable foundation. I'm not saying that the LCS teams are going to do this. I actually know from different sources that, like, FlyQuest was actually operating pretty well within their means. They always had been. I just think that the deal was too good for the Milwaukee Bucks group to pass up, because it seemed like they were floating it out there, and the Florida Panthers gave them a deal that they were excited about, right? There are other teams in the ecosystem that are likely going to either have to sell or want to sell. And I think that we would have seen some more change in the LCS, but the spot was not worth the initial, $10 to $30 million that were invested into it. So they decided to pause on that. So we'll have to see. This coming year will probably be more determinant to almost to the value of these spots and the position of the league going forward, more than any other season, most likely. And I don't think that we're heading, as much as other people are going to say we're heading down a bad path for it, I don't think that we are. Seeing these teams cut some budgets, invest more into talent across leagues. I would prefer NA, but there are still young players coming around from other leagues, I would assume, at some point here too, that are, in that 17, 18, 19-year-old range. Those investments are going to pay off. And that's what allows, like, this league needed a reset. This is a very necessary reset that I think that we are seeing. I know that's diving way deeper than what your initial question was, Jay, but I do think it is absolutely an important aspect of the business that we just have to talk about. People aren't talking about it. It needs to be talked about.
And it's the nature of the markets too. So one of the things that you see beyond just esports across all of business in general is that you never want to show weakness until everybody else does. And when they do, you dump all of your problems at once. It's basically a one-time, not get out of jail free card, but you want to keep projecting good growth, good earnings. All of a sudden, everybody needs to shed some dead weight. Dump all of our problems. You have a 6 month to year-long window to just say, okay, here's all of our problems. You'll see layoffs. You'll see everything else. You'll see everybody shedding what they consider their dead weight. And then from that point on, growth. You got to get back to it. That's the ebb and flow that comes with business. The LCS is in that point right now where we're trying to shed as much weight as possible.
Right. I do want to ask one last question because I know we kind of gone from a wide variety of topics, but I do want to kind of circle back to why we're here. We're talking about the free agency. And I know for some people, the money side of things is a little confusing. So I want to give each of you just one, if you had to pick one example or one thing that someone who may not understand the business side of this free agency period should know, what do you think is the most important thing that they should know going into Tuesday night?
I would say the most important thing to watch for, and I get flamed a lot on my own content for this, but I do think watching the ages of the players that are being signed is going to be a major indicator of what the team's plans are, not only obviously for this year, but moving forward as well. And this includes not just on the main team, but in academy teams. I think ages are going to very much determine how serious some of these teams are about the LCS and some of the changes that may be coming for how they operate within them. If you see both main teams and academy teams with like 23 plus players at most of the positions, then that to me is a major red flag of their actual investment into the future. And that's what I will be watching on Tuesday outside of just the talent, right? Because everybody's going to look at the talent, whatever, but player ages in esports matter as much or more than almost any other form of sports entertainment right now because of how short they generally are. So if some teams are just going for it to exist right in the middle, you might see a bunch of 23 to 28-year-old players whose futures with the organization may not extend past 1 or 2 splits, or maybe 3 if the LCS goes what the LEC is doing. So yeah, for me, ages. I'm obsessed with watching it because it does, I think, show the potential and growth for not only the teams, but the LCS as a whole as well.
I'm primarily looking on Tuesday to see, are these going to be entertaining rosters? I think the biggest problem that the LCS has at the moment is that we're trapped under this idea that if we don't win worlds and we're not competitive on the world stage, then nothing we do matters. And I think that's just entirely wrong and false. We have to be comfortable with the fact that we might not ever hit that stage, and find entertainment and find value in our region independently. And having rosters that people can get excited about, with all the cost savings, with everything else that's going to come in. Just, you want to be able to put 5 players out there that people want to talk about on social media and want to get involved with and want to go out to these events and see. I just want rosters that people genuinely like. And I think a lot of that, as shown by 100 Thieves last year, was that they had a team that made finals 3 splits in a row. It drove little to no fan engagement at all. And I don't expect that to be the case this year.
All right. With that, that's all the questions I have. Robert and David, thank you so much for this very informative side of things. As someone who doesn't come from a business background, it definitely answered a lot of questions that I had because I have no idea about finances in esports. So thank you so much for really bringing this conversation to a different light for me personally and for our viewers.
Thank you for having us on, man. Really appreciate it.
We've taken a look at the teams and we've taken a look at the business side of things, but who are the ones that actually cover the news? For that, we turn to members of the third-party media representing the LCS. Joining me now are Faisal Morali and Nick Geraci. Faisal Morali is a music major who was at the right place at the right time, and his work can be found at theclick.dg. Over the better part of the last decade, Nick Geraci has developed a unique voice in the league esports space as a columnist, built relationships with premier organizations, told captivating stories through interviews and features, and authored industry-shaking reports. Faisal and Nick, thank you guys so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Jay.
So one of the things that I always find important is that people don't necessarily have an understanding of what defines third-party media. Can you guys give me a definition of what you think third-party media means regarding the LCS?
Like for me, third-party media is any media that doesn't directly work with Riot. So that'd be any one of us, because we don't work directly with Riot. We don't work for them. We work with Riot with like working for our sites, making YouTube videos, making content that doesn't directly correlate with Riot. Whereas first-party media would be people like the casters, Riot content, that kind of stuff. That would be first-party media in my eyes.
Yeah, and to kind of jump off that a little bit in terms of reporting roster moves and stuff, where that difference really comes into play is that if someone is first-party media, looking at someone maybe associated with Riot or even with an organization or something like that, third-party media doesn't have an allegiance to these areas, and therefore, by extension, can be trusted to, if they're doing their job right, report without bias. And that's kind of where you get, people who can establish themselves as trusted sources because they're not, they're putting the truth above everything, including, good relationships with teams, allegiance to a game developer like Riot and that kind of thing. So that's like the main differentiator, I would say, within your definition too.
I think that's very important to bring up. We'll talk about trusted sources in a minute, but we've seen an evolution throughout just media history, from simple newspapers to television, now to the internet. In regards to the League of Legends aspect, how do people find out their information about free agency?
Reddit and Twitter, honestly. There's a couple accounts on Twitter, like Wooloo, for the LEC mostly. There's also the LCS EV or whatever he's calling himself these days. There's a couple accounts that really, like, their main purpose during the offseason is to push off-season rumors and off-season moves that are happening. I mean, of course, on Reddit, those tweets are reposted and repackaged and posted by there so people can get the information there as well. But from my perspective, it's mostly Twitter and Reddit that I've seen fans getting that information from. And it's only from a certain amount of people as well.
Yeah, I think the platforms have kind of remained the same for the most part throughout time. And I think that's kind of universal for League of Legends esports. Like the two main hubs, I think, for information content of most kinds is the League of Legends subreddit, like you said, and Twitter as a whole, right? And I think that you see that trend continuing, just with, like you said, more people kind of doing it. Back in the mid 2010s, we had reporters like Jacob Wolf, who kind of made his name on being those breaking news reporters, getting those inside scoops. But now I think there are still, people who are strictly known for that as journalists, like, Anonymodem, people like that. But you also have, like you said, these Twitter accounts who maybe aren't necessarily, right away like a journalist, or maybe they're just doing it completely on the Twitter account alone, where you do have more sources with varying levels, I think, of reliability, but you do have more sources kind of bringing things to light before things become official than we did maybe in previous years.
Mm-hmm. Nick, I want to ask you a little bit about that. One of the things you mentioned that I mentioned in the introduction, you've been around the scene for a little bit. Understanding this, do you feel like there is often a deeper trust in the media with more of these anonymous accounts showing up, or does it kind of serve as a reflection point that, okay, maybe there's another way to do this, and maybe there's a lot of questions that we have for the media, whether they're authentic or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a big talking point in the last couple of years. A lot of the quote unquote Pokemon reporter accounts or whatever with LEC Wooloo, LCS EV coming up, but there's definitely, it's a really nuanced discussion, because you have these guys who, these people who, at least at first, have only been known off of like a anonymous account associated with a cute Pokemon, right? But if you look at their track records over time, like they clearly have sources, and over time with these people, especially with like Wooloo, for example, since Wooloo's track record has only gotten, he's only been right more and more often with each year, simultaneously has, made himself accountable in the way of now he's done reports for Upcomer and the like. He's known by an actual name. So yes, his brand is the LEC Wooloo, but there's more accountability there. And as he's raised his level of accountability by kind of being more public with his identity, he's also, from what I've seen, been, more accurate more often than not. So I think like there's a conversation to be had. It's not that these, Pokemon accounts can't be correct. In fact, oftentimes they are. You know what I mean? That's why people start them. They know things that other people don't, right? Like no one would just be like, I'm going to try to do this and see what happens. Like people have seen the blueprint for enough years now. But the accountability factor of, if you're wrong, or if, you're just posting a lot of rumors that are maybe not, that's going to overall detract from the general conversation about what may be happening in the off season. And I think that is something that needs to be considered. It's not like, oh, these accounts don't deserve respect. Maybe they aren't right. Sometimes it's very much, I think it's a really important and overlooked thing about just the legitimacy of who we can trust. And that's all relative too, because, as we've talked about, nothing is official until it's official. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a lot of gray area in that conversation, but I do think that overall it helps generate a discussion of what we consider a viable source, even if the conversations to getting to that point aren't always easy.
Right. Hazel, you and I are part of that class of newer upcoming journalists. I've talked to Wooloo a little bit. We tried getting him onto the show. He wasn't available at the time. When we look at these blueprints and our own standards, when we're trying to establish ourselves as reporters, do you think that this is worth following as a potential model when we're trying to establish stories and get the right sourcing ahead of like major reports?
Yes and no. Yes, because there's like the proven track record, like Nick said, of these accounts having correct reporting, good sources, that kind of stuff. Yes, there's that there's that exists already, like that standard already exists. But no, at the same time, because now I've noticed over the last couple of weeks, there's also parody accounts that are parodying, however you say it, the Pokemon kind of way, where there's this, I think it's called LCS Swinub, I think is what they're calling themselves on Twitter, and they're posting just basically meme reports of like there was one where Sunday and Impact were retiring and making their own boy band kind of thing. So I think that kind of moniker, or the way that that kind of way that they're doing it is already played out. I think that as like new reporters, we're going to have to do it a different way, or we're going to have to find our own way to do it, because that cliche is already played out, and we need to find our own way to do it so we can stand out.
Nick, I'm going to start with you with this next question. When we go to free agency night, there's often a lot of buzz, especially from those first hours when the first roster's locked. Can you walk me through, like, when you were working with a newsroom, how that evening would go when you're trying to track all the rosters and figure out how the articles are going to go up?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you're, I think there are some things that might go overlooked, like from the outside looking in, because obviously there's a ton of reports that come out almost right away, or like even in in the hours leading up to it, or even a day before, etc. Right? But it really does ramp up in frequency in terms of what you're hearing. And when you're in a newsroom, obviously your own breaks are obviously the most important. If you can get something exclusive about a team or whatever, have a reliable source, like that's obviously a very elaborate process in its own right. But even if you don't, like, a big part of it was, as someone who's been in the industry for a while, I'm personally, I've done a couple breaks here and there, but I'm much more of like, a narrative focused kind of feature writer. So it oftentimes for the offseason for me, I was kind of winding down from Worlds features and stuff like that. And a lot of what I'd be doing mainly, while maybe some of my other colleagues were, chasing potential sources, was just being a catch-all net, right? Like if Jacob Wolf is reporting it, I'm writing something about it, so it's on our site. I obviously am crediting the initial reporter, but covering the offseason in a newsroom is not just about what you can find out yourself. It's documenting what everyone's found out on your site, not just the things that you found out yourself. And it can be absolutely crazy, especially if you're looking to, cover multiple regions. Obviously, the LCS hasn't been as busy as the LEC, but the LEC has been super busy. And then the LCK in their own right, hasn't had a ton going on. But we had the big move with Ruler. There's obviously a lot of stuff that will continue to happen in the coming months. And the LPL offseason alone is a full-time job in itself. I did LPL offseason tracking my last year with Invent Global, and it was absolutely bananas to try to keep track of that many teams and all their alternate rosters and all these things. So it really is, it's not just about, that's the biggest challenge. I think it's not just about what you're finding out. It's making sure that everything that's ever happened in the offseason can kind of be founded as a one-stop shop. And that's kind of what can set your newsroom apart, even if you're not first to something. If you're being more thorough than everybody else and more of a completionist, that has value in its own right.
Well, for me, it's a bit different because I'm the only writer that covers like League of Legends, esports, that kind of stuff for my site. I also don't have that many sources. So since I'm so new, we've only been here for about 2 years now. Basically what I do is, since I don't have a lot of sources, I'll have Twitter up. I have all the usual reporters: Wooloo, Nick, Jacob, Travis. Now recently with Nayman people, they're also getting some information as well. I've just been seeing what's going on, trying to build narratives from my head. I have not like a spreadsheet, but kind of like a notepad of different ideas. I don't want to, for me, it kind of feels weird writing about a roster that doesn't actually end up happening. Like recently there was the 100 Thieves rumors about double list Spica and Bjergsen signing to the team, and now it looks like Spica is not actually signing with the team. So it just like, and then if I write about that, it'll be outdated article right away. So I have a like a list of like ideas or different articles I can write about different rosters when they come up on the 22nd. Because as soon as they come up on the 22nd, people are going to be looking it up. They're going to be refreshing Twitter, refreshing Reddit. What information can they get about that roster? And then that's a perfect opportunity to put something out there, to get it out there. People will read it, be clicks, views, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, if I could even add on to your point, which I think is a good point, that's another thing, right? Like if you don't have your own sources and stuff like that, like if there's a bunch of big moves, or let's say there's a bunch of like multiple reported moves about like one team at one time, for example, like last offseason, the Vitality super team assembly, like there were multiple reports circulating at once, like the Karzi, Perks, and Alfari reports all had overlap. And, when you look at a situation like that, like you said, Faisal, like you can, if those are, obviously there's a risk to not, if that team idea ends up fizzling, but if you catch it at the right time, you can talk about the finer points of like, what would that look like? Would this roster make sense from an analytical perspective? Or, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach offseason coverage more than just exclusive breaks. Obviously that's going to be the tier one content, but that's kind of the point I'm trying to hammer home here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when I used to work at Stropsy, one of the big things that we looked at definitely was making sure, okay, there's dozens of rosters, but what are the ones that are the most important and that can set off the dominoes? Usually one of the big ones is always Team Liquid, regardless of the year, because Team Liquid will always go first. And once the dominoes fall from them, everyone else will go into place. Because once we knew where Bjergsen was going last year, for example, everyone else was starting to settle everything. Even teams like Cloud9, who are later, we kind of knew what was happening once we saw the dominoes falling because of this reporting. Which brings me to my next question about fact-checking and sourcing. One of the things that I learned in journalism school, shout out to Medill School of Journalism, is that you fact-check nearly everything. And I know I have my own process. Nick, you probably have your own. Faisal, you probably have your own. So I want to get both of your perspectives on how do you go fact-checking to make sure that this information is correct and accurate before you upload a site or an article to your site?
Nick, do you want to go first, or can I
Sure, I'll take this one, my man. No problem.
Yeah, go for it.
So obviously it depends on how sensitive the subject matter is of the report, right? But in general, I think you can never be too careful, right? Like first you want to make sure, like beyond the shadow of a doubt, that like everything your report is based on is already confirmed information. Like it's really easy to, especially when you're looking for things, to like be like, oh, well, that's 90% sure, so this probably happening makes more sense. Like, no, that's not actually like probable. Like, that doesn't actually work as far as, like something that you've heard that's 95% true isn't the justification for something that you might be trying to figure out that might be 60% true. You need to be operating completely on facts, first of all. Second of all, I think it's really important to, make sure you're on the same page with your sources. You don't want to betray those sources if the sources want to be anonymous, that kind of thing. But I also, if it's a hot button subject, I try to get more than one source, if I'm being honest with you. Just whether it be like, within, the same party that the first source is or not. I think You definitely can't be too careful with that. And then I think something that people always forget is when they're sitting on like a really hot, like a hot item like that, it's easy to just, I just want to get this out. I want to get it out first, click publish. Obviously you want to get out as fast as possible, but it's also really important to, if it's about like a signing for an organization, reach out to the org. Yeah, they're probably going to ignore you. Like they're probably not going to reply, or if they're going to reply, they're going to decline to comment. But doing that due diligence, one, shows that you reached out to the org to give them a chance to do and or say something before you went public with the move. And two, even a decline to comment is worth including in your report, because then readers know they're like, oh, what did Dig say? Oh, well, this person tried. They tried to reach out to the org. I can tell because they said Dig and Toss was reached out, but declined to comment. TSM was whoever the organization is, right? So I think like that's like a really, really important thing. Even if you don't end up getting anything, it shows you did your due diligence as a reporter, and therefore establishes your credibility further within the audience, because they know that they can trust that you didn't just go off of, oh, my buddy said this. It's like, no, like I checked my sources. I tried to get other sources. I did all my due diligence. I even reached out directly to the org with the knowledge that I have. And I think that that's really like important to creating like a complete and fully nuanced report that people can, trust you. Because then even if you, on the off chance you're wrong, you've covered so many bases that people give you the benefit of the doubt, like on a one-off, right? Because you've done so much to try to make sure that you're reporting the unequivocal truth of the situation.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Nick was saying, it's also very important, especially the social media age. You really want to make sure that your sources are correct, or that you have correct information, or else you'd run the risk of being called out publicly by the team itself or members of the staff of that team that may be implicated in those reports. And it could also hurt the chances of that player signing with a different team or the team that you're talking about. For example, there was a report from Wooloo who said that the Fanatics, I think it was an academy coach, had a clause in his contract that said that this year he'd be going up to the LCS, or the LEC, as part of the coaching staff. And almost immediately there was somebody that was calling him out from Fanatics saying, hey, this is not true. This is factually incorrect. And he had to go back and apologize for it. So like making sure that you're double checking, triple checking, maybe quadruple checking, depending on the sensitivity of the subject, is really important. So you don't have to go through that publicly on Twitter, which can hurt your reputation depending on how new you are to the scene with your sources or with people trying to pick information out.
Going back on that, I do want to ask a little bit about just the night itself. One of the things that's often key is looking for like the team posts or just confirmed sources. What do you guys look for that night when you are trying to come up with these reports?
Anything and everything from credible people, to be honest. That's what I look at. Like you can't be picky with that kind of information because everyone's hungry, everyone's wanting the information as fast as possible, and the sooner you can get it from someone that is credible or someone that has previously reported correct things or stated correct things about rosters, then you can take that and say, okay, you can usually assume from those people that they've double checked and triple checked, and that's why they're able to report it. No, that's not always the case, that would be clear, but usually you can. Pretty much I just look for anything and everything that's from a credible person. That's what I look for.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have kind of like a 3-tier system of like, you have like 3 tiers of things that you need to watch out for. Tier 1 is obviously official announcements. If something's official, it's official. That's obviously, there's no shadow of a doubt that that's something that's happening. So obviously that needs to be reported. The second tier is, like you said, Faisal, reports from reputable people. And that's, that's someone not only that you can trust, but that like, people who've established a name based on their reporting, like because of them being right, that's worth reporting because they're frankly almost always right if they are. And obviously everyone has their own different criteria of how to evaluate who is worth reporting on that level. But that's kind of that second tier, in my opinion. And there's a third tier where there are people who like, maybe I'm like, this person's up and coming. They clearly have gotten some stuff right. Maybe they're more of like a 50-50 kind of person. I'm not sure if they're, they're coin flipping on a source. I'm not entirely sure. And, that's obviously a judgment call on a case-to-case basis, but that's often, in my experience, like, oh, interesting. I'm going to make note of this and see if anybody else that I kind of put in that tier above them corroborates this, or just overall, I'm going to keep an eye on this because it could be true, but I'm not sure enough to report on it just yet based on, my own level of credibility in the scene.
Mm-hmm. With that, that's all the questions that I had. Faisal and Nick, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great speaking with you guys.
Finally, at the heart of every team are their fans. And if Worlds 2022 showed us anything, fans will come out in droves to support their teams. But in terms of roster planning, fans are often the biggest question marks, as while their feedback may not be immediately felt, it is still at the top of every player's minds. So as we wrap up our panels, I wanted to introduce two of NA's biggest fans who have skyrocketed as major community organizers. Angie Fan and Yael Maynard. Angie Fan, most known in the community as Numi, is a community manager for Travis Gafford Industries, is a co-host on the NA Man podcast, and single-handedly responsible for getting people the tickets they need for Worlds 2022. Yael, commonly known by most as Delphi, is a business major at the University of Central Florida who's passionate about fan interaction and content. Angie and Delphi, thank you guys so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having us here.
I'm so excited to be here.
So obviously the role of a fan is very different. You have a lot of fans in traditional sports kind of sporting that hype squad mentality with all the gear ready to go. And esports is a little bit of a different take. What is typically the role of a fan in the LCS?
I'll go. I think fans should support their teams and their players. And I think fans should watch their team's games and talk about them on social media and support players through like DMs or tweets or like Instagram, Snapchat, or I guess Twitter, TikTok. There's all kinds of ways that fans should support their players. And I think that is kind of the obligation of fans to do. I think we as fans are obligated to support our teams, but also to criticize them if we feel that they're doing something wrong. And I think fan criticism is valid.
She kind of took what I was going to say, but I also agree as well. I think the obligation and responsibility of a fan is to support your brand, whether that be fan art, community discussion, creating content, whatever social media platform that might be. I think a fan's responsibility is to support the brand, right? I also think that there is a time and place for yourself as a fan to give constructive criticism. You are, as a fan, supporting your brand, which also means that you kind of want to feel connected with the brand, the team, and the player that you support. So I think not only should a fan engage, whether that be active engagement or just lurking on a social media, I don't think there's anything wrong just to passively consume content. Passively, don't know if that's the right adjective, but also as well, like giving constructive criticism to a brand. I think in esports is very interesting in that you do have almost a direct line between your brand and your fan. Some organizations or some brands don't necessarily have that frontward facing interaction, which I find esports to be so interesting in. You can and are able to talk to your team and player. So I think a fan should give open and direct feedback, whether that be positive or neutral to constructive criticism.
I feel like we'll talk about this criticism point in a little bit because there's one blaring example of fan interaction gone horribly wrong. We'll talk about that in a second. I think both of you may know where I'm referencing here. I think you talked about the different ways on where and how to do so, but I want to ask a little more about that how element. Because there's obviously different degrees of fandom. You have fans who may be local, who are able to show up to the LCS every week. You have others who are across the country who kind of use these alt Twitter accounts or things like that as, I believe the correct word is like stan accounts and looking at pop culture. Angie, I know you're a community manager yourself working at TGI. How would you typically say that fans get involved? What's like some of the more common ways?
Yeah, I would say one common way is definitely through Twitter. I think specifically in esports, organizations and brands use their Twitter well or not well, depending on the level of interaction. So I think Twitter is a great way not only to interact with the brand or team, but also to interact with other people in that community. I find that with Twitter, if it's more interesting to be on Twitter if you're following specific topics, right? It's a little different from, I think, Facebook or Instagram, or TikTok rather, where that content is kind of given to you, or you have to wait for the algorithm to sponsor it to you. I think with Twitter, you need to find the content you're looking for. And when you start engaging, you're realizing that there's other communities or social spaces you can be a part of. So I would definitely say that one aspect of it would be Twitter. Specifically for esports, I'd say Discord is actually a great way as well. A lot of organizations have very specific Discord servers for their brand, and even some pro players have Discord servers for themselves. So it's kind of a great way to be in a little pocket and to be with other people in that pocket. So I would say my top two is definitely Twitter and Discord. I would put Reddit a little bit as well, but I'd say Reddit is more consuming content and reacting more than just interacting and very active content. So I think those would be my two spaces.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point to you, Delphi, at you guys, the NAMN podcast group has kind of shown a different side of things, how you can take an element of modern media in the form of a podcast or in the form of a community server, like Angie mentioned, and kind of accelerate that to a newer degree. So how would you say, like, from a material standpoint, not necessarily a consumption level like a social media is, how would you say like a material manner is important in the fan, I don't want to say fan verse, but that's kind of where I'm getting
Fan
at.
space.
Fan space. Yeah, fan space.
So I think there's certain things in spaces like esports, especially, that are like, there's a line that's org produced and there's a line that's like player produced, and there's a line that's fan produced. I think like podcasts and get to know the player videos and stuff like that, a lot of it is under fans, like fan art as well. And I think like we try to approach that as fans, like making content for our fellow fans. We're not like trying to be something we're not. We just act as fans and produce fan content for other fans.
I was gonna say, just to elaborate on that point a little bit, as a fan, I would love to see stuff like get to know the players, right? I think that's a responsibility as an organization to provide the baseline for that content, right? You as a brand are sponsoring your team and players. You should probably tell people who they are and what they're interested in or how they're like. But I think as a fan too, you can have a responsibility to be like, oh, this player has these interests or has expressed stuff like this, and very quick form content to bring someone who's interested in the brand, organization, or team to be like, hey, here's our 5 quick facts about this specific pro player that you may not know about, but might be interesting to you. I think that type of content is appealing for me. Not only get to know content, but just like fun edits or just fun free form short content that a brand may not necessarily create on their own, right? I feel like a brand should be focusing on maybe long-standing, long form, lasting content, while a fan, maybe I want to see like a 30-second TikTok on a specific thing. So I think as a fan, we want to create content that I want to see on my timeline, that would bring other people into enjoying what we enjoy. So
I definitely like agree with what Numi said, but I also like kind of want to like bring up a point that she talked about for a little bit. Even though fans can make content, and we do make content, it's really, really difficult to create some certain types of content without the orgs doing things first. Like, for example, if I want to make a video about 2 players and their friendship, and I just don't have any content from the org, like no streams from the players, no YouTube videos, no documentary, no like fun games with the team. There's nothing I can do to show people that these 2 are friends and they're close and you guys should like them because they have a cute friendship. So I think like the orgs also have some responsibility in helping the fans create their fan content.
Speaking of which, I want to ask about the interaction between organization and fans. Every time I've talked to a player, I always make sure I ask, do you have anything you want to say to the fans? And obviously fan presence is definitely known throughout every team. But I want to know from you two, and it doesn't matter who starts this. Why is it important to an organization to have fans supporting them?
I think it's important because I just having people support you as an organization it empowers your players, and fans also engage with the content you put out. You make money from the fans. They buy merch, they watch their videos, and more importantly, they support your team. When your team performs poorly, they will defend them. They will defend the players. They will make content of the players. And I think what's most important about fans is their support. It's more than monetary. It's the support, just the feeling of support that fans provide. And I think that's why fans are so important to orgs.
I completely agree with that. Just to piggyback on that point as well, you're creating long-term connections, right? There is that short-term benefit of a fan buying your merchandise or a fan maybe going to the studio or a game for the first time, but also between a fan and a brand, it creates that connection. It creates a relationship to where I, as a fan, feel connected to my brand because of A, B, and C. These are the things that they've done for me that make me feel welcomed and warmed. And I want to continue feeling like this and supporting this team, player, or brand. So I think it just creates these long-term connections. And I think that's very useful in the long run, right? Not only was Delphi talking about when a player or team does poorly, you have your fans defending you or giving constructive criticism when needed, but also as well, it gives a human aspect to your brand, right? And this is a little bit outside esports, but I feel like some of the more successful social media campaigns are because there's a human element involved, whether they're creating a human connection or displaying that connection. So I think between a fan, right, it humanizes these players and these organizations to be like, this isn't just a corporate one-on-one relationship I have. It feels like I belong in this community, and they've cultivated an area where I can belong and continue in this area. So I definitely think it's so important for fans to be there for brands, or at least to invest in fandom culture or fandom relationships, because you're creating that long-term relationship that will benefit you in the future.
Yeah, definitely understood. I think something that's actually very interesting, Angie, I'm going to direct this question to you on this one. Overseas, I don't know if you were at any of the other events outside of San Francisco, but
unfortunately I was not.
I know, but you definitely watched it, and you saw a lot of Eastern fans having these neon signs. For example, you had fans with flags and posters, and then you had the North American fans who were, they had the signs, but there was definitely a different interaction. As a community manager, do you feel like there is a difference between how certain teams like LPL and LCK have fan interactions versus how we in North America may do it?
I can definitely agree that there is a difference between kind of Eastern fandom and Western fandom. I definitely love the neon signs. I like seeing the culture. I think seeing, if you were at League of Legends Worlds, the group stages in New York, there was actually a birthday cafe for a Korean pro player there. That's not necessarily something you see in Western culture. I don't see that in Western culture, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? I think Western fans interact with their players and teams differently than Eastern. Neither one is good nor bad. It's just a different type of interaction and how a fan wants to feel engaged, right? So if an LPL or LCK fan expresses their admiration through a birthday cafe or neon signs, or maybe I saw like a fan banner project, you can hold up these little slogans that people create from their own money, mind you. I don't think the organization or teams sponsor this. This is from their own pockets, and they do this for the love of their team. North American fans express this differently, right? I think North American fans are on Reddit and Twitter a lot more, right? Or they're creating fan meetups. I think I saw some North American fans in finals, at least, because they were unable to get tickets to World's finals. They tried doing meetups or creating these spaces where you can watch the games if you didn't have a ticket. So I think the culture is a little different in how you interact. I don't think one is better nor worse. I just think that, it's just a different way that you express your admiration. And that kind of goes to show that the love for your team or org is very multifaceted and cultural as well, right? You don't see these types of aspects in Eastern culture nor Western culture. And I think they're both really amazing ways to express your admiration for an org.
Definitely. I think part of the reason you see the difference in the way fans interact with players and organizations is like, it's definitely a cultural thing. It's just not, it's like League is a big deal in like both China and Korea in different ways, of course, because they're not the same country, but like it's seen as like more important than it is in America, right? So people take it more seriously. And you saw Chinese or EDG fans, they bought a Times Square billboard for Mako with their own money.
Oh my gosh,
That's
I think I saw that.
incredibly expensive.
I think I saw that.
Yeah,
so
that's
you see
nuts.
like, yeah, so you see like these people that like, there's like what, 100 million people on the Chinese league server? That's insane, right? So you see like there's more people playing League, so therefore there's more people supporting League, and it's not seen as a game for, well, in North America, it's kind of a game for like sweaty nerds who can't play sports in high school, right? And regardless of how true that reputation is, that's the reason we don't see this kind of interaction and engagement, because it's not as big of a deal. Like League is a phenomenon in some of these, in certain areas of the world, and it's just not the same in America. And I would also include Europe in that, because Europe kind of has the same reputation, like League has the same reputation in Europe as it does in America. So I think the reason we saw the big difference between Eastern fans flying all the way from like Korea and China to watch their teams versus Western fans like showing up but not really engaging as much, you know?
Right. I think we do have to kind of address one of the biggest elephants in the room regarding fandom, and that is the SKT trucks. I feel like, for those who may not be aware, SKT fans, after one of their losses, rented a billboard and found, I believe it was the headquarters, and had this rather negative message for the management staff of T1. In North America, we will have that in the form of pretty nasty Twitter comments. So especially as we get closer to free agency, when we're talking about how players perform and criticism, do you believe there is a healthy line between criticism and overall harshness?
I can speak on this because I became a T1 fan in 2020. They were the early 2020, yeah. They were my first league team I ever watched. Obviously, Faker, you know, everyone knows Faker, and everyone's a fan of T1 basically. And when the whole drama with LS happened, like LS joining T1, it was like Truck City over there, you know? And I talked about how it's like League, and especially T1, because they're like the biggest Korean League team, how it's seen in Korea. That can also lead to things like renting out trucks and saying interesting things about the coaching staff and the management, and like kind of doing kind of extreme behavior when it comes to their team not succeeding, right? And I think there's definitely like a line, and I think North American fans also cross it. It's not like Eastern fans are crazy, they rent out trucks. Saying certain things to pro players in their Twitter DMs is also extremely wrong. And I think we should recognize if we're engaging in that behavior and stop it. And I think we should call out people who are engaging in that behavior as well, because the reason it happens so often on Reddit, and the reason I'm not personally on Reddit very often, is because it's kind of an echo chamber. When you see these posts criticizing these pros, you just see like it's like a negative feedback, just like constant negativity. And you see one positive person, they get instantly downvoted. They're like, why are you being so positive about this? This person's playing like garbage, right? And I think like criticism is fine. And I've said that before. It's pro players and organizations are not immune to criticism, but there's certain lines that people cross that is way too far. And I think it's on the wrong side of the line, the same way the trucks that people send to T1 HQ are.
Honestly, Delphi said everything I was going to say as well. I would add a small point to this. I would say that as a fan, I encourage you to challenge yourself in the spaces that you're in, whether that be social media, Discord, or even real life spaces, right? Look at the people that you surround with. I myself try not to participate in echo chambers because I understand that may be a vocal minority that I might be vocalizing as well, right? I want to surround myself, and I speak purely for myself. I try to surround myself with people that I am encouraged, inspired, and want to be around, right? That type of mentality kind of protects me from this negative feedback loop of this pro player sucks. We lost North America. Like, it exists, and I will acknowledge that it exists, but to participate and engage in it in a not constructive manner is not going to do anything in the long run, right? MSI and Worlds, I feel like every time MSI or Worlds or any international competition comes up, there's this constant feedback of don't say bad things to your pro players, right? They are human like the rest of us. So I would definitely encourage yourself as a fan to look at the spaces you're in and kind of think before you tweet or send that Reddit comment. And it kind of goes back to the point you made earlier, Jay, of how can fans participate in spaces? I would say myself as a fan, I don't want to give like this negative, unnecessary feedback, right? I have a right to say what I think, and when I may not believe in something, but that there is a line to be crossed. And I would definitely encourage fans to think about something before you say something, or just step away from the monitor or computer. I would definitely challenge everyone to look at your perspective and reshape that.
I do want to also make sure we do touch upon free agency a little bit in regards to the fans. Obviously, there are definitely heartaches and also excitement when new players join teams and old, or I don't want to even say old teammates, but players who've been on the roster for a long time leave for new opportunities. And when these roster announcements do get announced, fans can have mixed reactions. Some people are very excited. Others may be like, why is this player joining the team? A big example of that for me in modern memory was 2017 when Sven Skaren got announced to join Cloud9 after a difficult split on TSM. A lot of fans were kind of torn about that. So I want to know from you two, can you describe why fans may have a mixed reaction when either a player leaves or a player joins, or a coach joins, and etc.?
I think as a fan, right, you form this connection with your organization, with the brand, the players, the GMs, and the staff, whether that be that they make content or not for you to enjoy, to like create that connection, right? You kind of live with these players for 3 to 4 months, or even a year, and then to have these players just kind of suddenly go away or to be split up, it kind of breaks that connection you have, right? And it kind of feels like you're like a kind of like a yearbook goodbye, like a end of school goodbye kind of feeling. You're like, I had these great memories with these players and teams, and now we're kind of breaking up. So I think that's why a fan can feel a little disheartened sometimes when seeing these announcements, right? Because you've kind of invested your personal time and now they're gone. But I think too, it's also very encouraging to kind of see that players that you're interested in kind of grow into a new space, right? To get new opportunities or to develop a skill that they may not have developed if they stayed on a team. Or if you do watch your team, like I think, for example, like LCS 100 Thieves, who stayed together for quite a bit, like you create that long-term connection, you see these players grow and you keep growing with them, right? So I think as a fan, it can be a little difficult with like almost like a breakup in a way, but I would encourage fans just to kind of like look on them and kind of like say like farewell, but also I'm excited and good luck. So
yeah, like personally, I can give an example. When Genji announced Ruler leaving, it was like 3 a.m. for me, and I cried in my bed, and I was just so sad because like when you think of Genji, you think of Ruler. When you think of Ruler, you think of Genji, and like it just really, it hurts more than you really expect it to when a player leaves their like home like that. Essentially, it's like I'm happy for him. He's literally exploring the market to see what his worth is, and he's worth a lot. He's like the best ADC in the world, and I'm happy that he knows that he's valuable, and I'm glad that he is trying to find his worth. But at the same time, as a fan of the team, like I was a huge Genji fan this year, and I mean I've been a huge Genji fan, but particularly this year I really love this roster, and like to see Ruler leaving, Lahen's rumored to leave, other people rumored to leave the team. It's like this is like it feels like it feels like something you had is just like it is being lost and you have no control over it. I think that's the worst part. There's just absolutely nothing I can do that Ruler's leaving Genji, and I just have to sit here and be like, okay, well, I guess I'll support him on a new team. So I think it's the pain of like following something so closely and being a fan of the way they interact, the players interact, and the way they play together, and losing that without having any control over it. That is the hardest part for fans.
I can definitely relate to that one, being a little sad when he was on C9, Impact leaving to Team Liquid. Didn't cry for that one, but I was still pretty sad for a few days for that one. My last question is kind of more of a philosophical one, I would say. Obviously, as I mentioned at the top of the segment, if fans had the way with the rosters, we don't know how things would be. But there is still kind of a sense of understanding, kind of something that Angie mentioned, the trust in the organizations. So I wanted to ask, do you guys feel like fans feel that teams listen to them in regards to certain decisions, whether it be popular or unpopular? Or is there kind of like a feeling of trust and understanding that like, we know that this may be a weird decision, but in quoting the words of Jack Etienne, trust the process?
It definitely varies team to team. I was talking to my friend who is a C9 fan, and he was talking about the rumored ERL pickups for C9 mid, and he said something that kind of was like surprising to me. He said, yeah, I have no idea who these people are, but I've seen it. I've seen Cloud9 work with these new people before and make it successful, so I trust them. So even though he didn't really know what was going on, he was like, oh, but I trust them, right? I trust their decision making, and I trust that they can make these new players work. And it sounds bad to say this, but I personally don't feel the same way about like any team. It's not necessarily that I don't trust the organizations. It's that I am a person who always wants to be involved. And if I see a team making decisions with no like explanation why, I just kind of get annoyed, and I'm like, I feel like you guys should be more open. But I understand right now, like before free agency, obviously they can't be open about everything. But it's like, it definitely varies based on team, and also varies based on amount of communication. Because if you make decisions and don't communicate a single word to your fans, it's very difficult for fans to trust what you're doing, right?
Yeah, I feel like I've hammered this point a lot during the talk of this panel, but kind of what we mentioned earlier, right? The long-term investment of creating a fandom space and trust in that fandom space kind of comes out here, right? If you trust in your organization to make roster decisions, you can kind of feel more comfortable when like free agency is like on the verge or being announced and stuff, and you feel comfortable with the organization despite like and trusting them, right? I think like a counterpoint to Delphi, I myself am very new to LCS still, but I think CLG, for example, is a good representation of this. I think CLG does a lot of trust between their fans and the brand, but also too, right? I trust the staff as well to make these decisions, right? I trust the players to make their own decisions. There is communication between like this brand and their fans, and they do have long-term fans that have stayed with them for quite a while. So I think that investment in fandom spaces is so important for times like these, right? Where you say like, hey, look, like this is what we're coming out with. Do you trust us? This is what we have, and this is what you're going to work with for the next 3 months or a year. And that, I don't think that goes just specifically for CLG. I think that goes for LCS teams in general. To invest in fandom spaces, you get this long-term reaction of like, hey, I trust you. I might not know what you're doing. I trust that you'll communicate, and I trust the staff that you have in place to make me feel like I can cheer you on for next season.
All right. With that, that's all the questions that I have. Angie and Delphi, thank you guys so much for joining me.
This was a lot of fun. It's kind of my first time doing something like this. This was a lot of fun, and thank you so much, Jay, for inviting me. Like I had such a good time.
Yes, thank you for inviting us to be on. I had a good time.
This is the year that 100 Thieves becomes one of the top fandoms in the LCS. We've had good results for years now. We've made finals, 3 back-to-back splits, but yet we haven't had that fandom that feels like it rivals Cloud9 or TSM or any of these big names. We've spent years developing younger players like Kenvi, who went to Immortals, like Busio, like Tenacity, like Luger and Poom, who are now on CLG. We've had many players come from our ecosystem. And if EG showed last year, it's that these younger players that can act on behalf of your org and grow with your brand are so important. So if you take these younger players that we have and you put them with some high quality veterans that might be able to develop them into superstars, then you have a team that can take you into the skies and take you literally anywhere. Now, it has been rumored that we might get 2 big names with 100 Thieves, maybe 2 of the biggest names to ever play in the LCS, maybe 2 players that also were holding a trophy while walking down the middle of the Chicago venue. If that happens, and as a 100 Thieves fan, I'm praying to God, life is gonna be great. Even if that doesn't happen, we get somebody else, we have good talent to be developed. And this is one of those that you can jump on ship with being a 100 Thieves fan now and be happy through at least 2025, 2026, because we got Sniper in the wings as well.
All right, so I'll be talking about Cloud9 here. Cloud9's in a very interesting position themselves. Their roster was able to take a championship in summer, but falter briefly at the World Championship, like a lot of NA teams. If I was in Cloud9's position, what I would be doing is focusing on the core that is in place, while also trying to introduce some newer talent, whether it be going through the academy system, through the ERLs, or anything in between. I feel like Cloud9 should continue their investment into young talent that they once had, bringing players like Blabber in to the system. Ultimately, I feel that Cloud9, whatever decision will be made, will be a combination of keeping some of their namesake players while also introducing some new talent to the world that we may not be as familiar with.
What do I think CLG should do this offseason? I think what they should do is keep the core of their team together mainly. That'd be Dokla in the top lane, their bot lane the same, mid lane the same. I think they can upgrade from contracts. Contracts had a really down spring, but a really up summer, so I don't really think he's really that consistent. I could see them going for someone like a closer, or maybe they make a play for Spica, but I really want to see them keep their team the same. I don't want to see them really change out a lot of pieces, because they had a lot of good synergy, and they had a really good resurgence in the summer. So I want to see them keep it together and see if they can continue the momentum into next year.
I don't think there's any way around, acknowledging the fact that Dignitas enters this offseason at a crossroads. In summer, yes, they struggled, but the nature of how they finished their season, specifically with, transferring over to Golden Guardians, had a lot of fans from the outside looking in, feeling like they had kind of just, given up and were just trying to, make some money under his contract. Obviously, we don't know exactly what the particulars of that deal were, but I think that, you have people sort of down in this organization, not even in a performance level, but just in almost like an effort to the league level. And I feel like people want to see more out of them. We have fans outright like tweeting at Mr. Beast, begging him to buy the organization. That's something you see very often, right? So far, all Dig has done is release Blue. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think Blue got more criticism than he deserved. And I think that he exceeded expectations on a bit individually. But he's a very, kind of one-dimensional mid laner, very focused on, he had like the most farm but the least roam percentage and really strong DPM despite the team not being, because he was their main damage source. But overall, I think more than anything, this is going to be a year to see like how much Dig values like their level of competition in the LCS. Are they okay with, being the occasional upstart team? Then that's that. Or if they want to be a true contender, we need to see a big shift from them for sure, because I think that, maybe not with the league itself, but with fans, they are on a shorter leash, I would say, than maybe previous seasons.
How can EG win this offseason? I think with the pickup of Kelsey Moser as their head of coaches, they already won a massive part of it. Kelsey Moser is someone who I am a huge fan of. She watches different regions. She's a big fan of academy and development and amateur. And I think her direction for the team is a good one. And I think it's really telling that Peter Dunn is like happy about this decision. On the fan side, I think what they can do to win off season is just keep Jojo Pyun. Jojo Pyun and Danny were fan favorites last year, or I guess this year. And keeping Jojo Pyun, like while Danny obviously is off the roster for reasons out of their control, keeping Jojo Pyun is the easiest way to keep fans. He's lovable. International fans absolutely adore him, and everybody likes him. There's nobody that genuinely is like, oh, I just hate Jojo Pyun. He is so unfunny and we don't like him, right? That's just not a thing that happens. And I think if you keep Jojo Pyun on your team, you keep a massive portion of your fans that you gathered, especially like people who became fans of EG this year. So I think that's the two main ways that EG can win this offseason.
FlyQuest is definitely going through what one would call an upheaval. Trisha is over at marketing for C9 and has stepped down as the COO of FlyQuest. Instead, we have Papa Smithy, whose purported title is Chief Gaming Officer, but we're gonna go with General Manager for now because that was his previous title at 100 Thieves, and he is credited for a bunch of 100 Thieves scouting. With that in mind, we don't have any confirmed leaks about FlyQuest, but we do know who is more likely than not to not be on. Aframu seems safe. Seems like he's probably still going to be there. He's basically their flagship player at this point. But Takui and Jose Diodo, two of the most novel players actually from last year's season, likely won't be returning. They both posted tidbits about how they are looking for their opportunities, and it does seem like both Takui and Jose Diodo have had some offers. So FlyQuest, bit of a rebuild year, and not even as a meme, actual rebuild year.
Golden Guardians will win offseason, and my opinion for that is you have this roster that has played together before. Not only some as players, but also as coaches, right? These are not new teammates. They have played together in some way, and you have brand value or name value on top of that. I think that's pretty important when it comes to off season or during the season, right? You have these players that have played together and know each other and are comfortable with each other. That also creates an environment where they feel comfortable expressing their constructive feedback and what they can do to improve. This is not a new roster, and I know some people might be like, oh, what is the benefit of it? They have played together before. There's experience, there's name value, and that I think is important. On the social fan interaction side, Golden Guardians is quietly upping their social media game. Their activation with finals was, I think, really good timing for off-season roster stuff. I think in itself, like, their social media game has been to create these kind of fandom stuff, right? They were giving out licorice player Polaroids at finals. They gave out a finals ticket. Their social media is catering to like a almost culture like fan, like K-pop angle. So I would say for the fan interaction, keep a lookout for Golden Guardians. They are going to smash 2023 with that social media interaction. And I definitely encourage you to look at that over the next year.
Mortals is a team that on paper has a lot of potential. Specifically Revenge. Last time I talked to him, he claimed he was the best Fiora in North America, and I want to believe him, but man, I haven't seen it. Power of Evil has proven he's a great player. Ignar is an innovator in his role, and he's done crazy stuff, played Nico support on stage, because why not? Kenvi and Lost are question marks for me. Lost has, appropriate to his name, seemed lost in most of his games, unfortunately. And Kenvi is a solo queue jungler on an LCS team who really needs to figure out what his playstyle is. Ultimately, I'd love to see Immortals succeed, but they don't really have a strong branding and a strong identity. If they can find that this split and really work around their best players, then I could see them working their way up to the mid-tier and hopefully improving through the year.
Team Liquid, I expect them to be a very conflicted roster. Last year I had Steve Aronset, their CEO, on my podcast a few months ago, and he was talking about the promises and the expectations he sold to investors and to sponsors in years prior to last year, before going out and signing Bjergsen and building this massive, the super team of the LCS, a $5 million+ salary type expense. I don't think we're going to see that this year. Not because Steve doesn't care. So I think Steve, Aaron said himself, really wants to win and that he'll try to build a roster that's very competitive. I think if given the opportunity and payment made sense, that he would love to have Double Lift back on his team. But at the same time, I think that he's facing what is ultimately an abysmal failure, the fact that he didn't make the World Championship with the previous team. And so now he's in a position where he's going to have to craft a team that can both be competitive to fulfill his own personal goals and the team's legacy, while also having to work around, being more fiscally conservative, but not spending as much money as he has in prior years. So I'm excited to see what Team Liquid does. I think
that they are showing their hand pretty substantially with some of the moves that they have already made by letting go of their academy squad. I do expect them to have 5 veteran players. I would be very surprised to see anybody younger or coming up from the academy squads of even other teams, obviously, at this point. And when I'm looking at the different positions, I still believe that Chime will be staying. I believe AD carry wise that they're going to go with somebody who's a North American veteran. I do believe they're going to stay with Maple. I also believe they're going to stay with Solo. And I think their jungler is a complete wild card just as to where they could go and grab them from. There were options specifically in the LEC that I was really looking at, but those don't look to be happening. So TSM fans are going to look for probably a very disappointing free agency and a team that will probably be very middling at best.
And there you have it. With free agency kicking off in 24 hours, we hope that you took the opportunity to learn who's involved, why it happens, how it's shared, and who it impacts. A huge thank you to all the panelists who took the time to record and share their thoughts. All their socials will be in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and share with your friends. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in 2023.